This video is going to look at the emphasis on AO2 when you're constructing paragraphs in your answers on Lord of the Flies. The example I'm going to use is two different types of verbs. I'm mainly going to focus on modal verbs, but also look quickly at reflexive verbs as well. So just a reminder that a modal verb is an auxiliary verb, and they express the degree of modality for the main verb. So whether it's possible, whether someone's got an ability to do it, whether it's necessary, the possibility of it actually taking place. Also known as conditionals, and those verbs are must, shall, will, etc. And also their negatives, so must not, mustn't, shall not, shan't, all of these. And they will always go with another verb. So for instance, if you use a modal verb must with the other verb play, we must play. You've got the auxiliary verb and play as the other verb. And after that recap, let's just think about how modal verbs reveal a lot about characters, not just in Lord of the Flies, obviously that's what we're concentrating on, but think about what it tells us about the character. Jack often uses must and ought, showing how strongly he feels, that he's a sort of character who's going to drive things forward. He's not collaborative, it's about what they want to, he wants them to do. Ralph talks about can and could. He talks about possibilities and how to improve things and what they could be doing and can be doing to make their lives better, make rescue more possible for them all. So we need to think about what their language, the language selection that Golding uses, tells us about the characters. So let's think about the top orange box. We have obviously Jack here. I ought to be chief. We ought to have more rules. Ralph uses the positive can, and Piggy often uses could and should, and it shows us a lot about them. Ralph rarely uses must in the way that Jack does, but when he does, it's about something that is the benefit of everybody in the group, not just to satisfy his own wishes. So we must make smoke on top of the mountain. We must make a fire. It's not about what he wants, it's about what is best for everybody. I also want to touch very quickly on reflexive verbs. So a reflexive verb has a direct object the same as its subject. So I blame myself, they congratulated themselves. So it will have the same semantic agent as the patient. So the person who does the action is the same person the action is directed at, which is a complicated way of saying it. You'll all be very familiar with reflexive verbs. The novel Lord of the Flies actually opens with a sentence with a reflective verb, with Ralph, the boy with the fair hair, lowered himself down the last few feet of rock. And that already, using that reflexive verb, Golding is giving the reader an insight into Ralph's character. We see that he's strong, that he's capable, he's self-reliant. He's not asking someone to help him, he's lowering himself. And we see this reflected all through the novel. We see that self-reliance that Ralph has that makes him such an effective leader. First, there was a log on which he himself sat. It's all about him being on his own, apart from the others. He has this sense of control and an agency, mostly over his own actions. Obviously, the huge exception to that is the chapter View to Death, where he stops having that agency, and you don't see Golding using the same reflexive verbs. If we move on and think about how we could use this information in essays, it's really useful to have some very concrete examples of AO2. We can all make really excellent points about what happens in the novel, but when we want to think about Golding using language, it's really useful to have a few little tricks or quotations just up your sleeve that you can bring out and that you compare with terminology, and also, importantly, link those to the writer's message and bring in some AO3. So if we're thinking about a question, how does Golding portray the variation in character of the boys on the island, we would make sure our paragraph had all the normal things in the topic sentence, the quotation, some analysis, evaluation, the context, and a focus sentence, bringing it back to the question at the end. Now, the next slide has an example of how you might use modal verbs in this. I'm not going to read it out. It's probably easier if you pause the video and have a look through, but you can see that by using the terminology to answer the question and focus on Golding's message, you're really putting yourself in a very good position to access the higher levels on the mark scheme by making it clear that these aren't people, they are creations of Golding, which he is using to portray a message. And if you start talking about the language choices of Golding, you're making it very clear that that's where your answer is going. So that is the first part of the paragraph, and it concludes here. So as you can see, there's the focus sentence at the very end, with verb choices are fundamental in showing Golding's contrast between the boys. So it brings everything back round. There's background into Golding's life and why he may think that way, bringing in your AO3, great use of terminology, and also some higher level vocabulary. I hope this is a helpful look at how one might use modal verbs and terminology. It's worth maybe drafting a few quotations where modal verbs are used, adding those to your quotation list and learning them so you always have a fantastic example to pop into your essays. Thank you.